maybe we could start with this if you're okay with it. Every profession and vocation allows that person to have a specific view on humanity, on, in this case, what would be, living well and dying well. And I'm curious, with you being the spiritual director, the sociologist, the writer, the lecturer, prof, what do you see? How has those things helped shape your view on death and living?
Well, I'd say as a spiritual director, you have the privilege of being invited down into the foxhole with people. So, whereas most people, when they're suffering or dying, to some degree, edit what they say to other people. They don't want to impose pain on them. Sometimes they don't want to get into conversations that elicit responses they don't want to hear, like advice or platitudes or whatever can happen, or just a too small of a response to something of such magnitude. But with a spiritual director, they open up. They say whatever it is that they're saying to God. The spiritual director gets to hear that. And I think over time as a spiritual director, and first it happened when I was a counselor working with people, I learned that some of the questions that come my way really are prayers. So people will say, why is this happening to me? How can this be allowed? How can a loving God allow this to happen? And when I was younger, I used to think I had to maybe come up with answers to that. Now I just appreciate the honesty of it and that people have the trust in God to ask God those questions. So I think my view of how people approach the ends of their lives has been shaped more profoundly by my work as a spiritual director and also just my life as a friend to people as they go through life than it has even with all the philosophical and sociological and theological things that I've read about the subjects. All those, I assume, become background as I listen to people.
Interesting. I assume so that would kind of make sense. People would be more willing to talk to you, kind of like maybe like a priest as well. But you mentioned the questions kind of are kind of like prayers, and so you being able to hear in on those things, it would be an experience for you to have, as long with redirecting to them. And in our conversations before, I really appreciated how you talked about the spiritual direction, helping people remember spiritual happenings and then putting that back, because it's easy as people to forget those things. But the questions as prayers and people telling you things that they might not necessarily tell anybody else, and that kind of puts you in a really, and I mean this in a positive connotative way, like a really privileged position.
Absolutely. It's an enormous privilege. And it touches on my own questions. So it is an enormous privilege to accompany people. And right now, there are a couple of people in my practice who are consciously contemplating what they think is the nearness of their own deaths. One without any particular disease process, though she's quite old, but for the last year has been consciously trying to prepare herself for the end, which she thinks is coming. And then two others who have Alzheimer's diagnoses. So that's complex. They're kind of approaching the end of their lives as they've known their lives, though not necessarily death itself for a while. And that can be more scary. And not too long ago, a directee of mine did pass away. And I was looking back at some of the things she wrote to me. Part of what she discovered was she became more grateful, grateful for the people she loved in her life, grateful for what her life has allowed. And she had episodes in the hospital where she would almost die for about a year or more. And she said she started to wonder about God preserving my life at 75 when so many others didn't get to live that long. But she said ultimately she didn't ask for any reasons. The invitation for me seems then to be to surrender to whatever is my current reality. That is, in this case, that I don't need to know why, just surrender to the reality that God allows things to work out so that I'm still alive, and I do not have to justify my existence. She said my inner critic still comes around with that, though. She says she is still able to do things. She is able to love others. She can't do all of the, or she couldn't at that point, and she's gone to heaven now. Couldn't do all the things she was used to doing. And in some of your questions, Matthew, I started to think about what I've noticed across all these different people that I've accompanied to the ends of their lives. And part of what I've noticed is that there is a necessity to attend to the past and the future, to address certain things related to both those time periods in order to have the freedom to truly dwell in the present. So the people I've worked with all, to some degree, address regrets, some reparations. Some I've known have really conscientiously contacted everyone who's meant something to them just to say goodbye and to say how their lives were shaped by that particular person. Some things from the past. Sometimes it's hopes that they'd carried for a long time that just aren't going to be realized, that they need to surrender. So they address the past, they address the future. So a number of people become quite conscientious about setting up trusts, wills, all that kind of legal stuff to help people who survive them. They declutter so that the people left behind don't have to do that. And in the case of the woman I was just quoting, she had two relatives who were dependent adults for whom she carried all the legal and financial weight. And she managed to pass those responsibilities on to other relatives and even train them in that. So once she had addressed some things from the past and things from the future, she was able to really just be in the present, which, of course, was a place of love and gratitude, but also grief. Grief that this life she loved so much was not going to continue much longer. And I wrote about one of these people who I accompanied to her death. She, I call her in Candlelight, the book I wrote, I call her Ruth. And what she said with respect to that sort of past, future, present, this is when I was with her, like the night before she died. She asked me to come and give her communion and to anoint her with oil. And in doing that, I read the 23rd Psalm to her. And she said, he does lead me in right paths. I'm past regretting all the dead ends I explored and the meandering and traipsing I did in getting here. It's all part of the path I was on, and I know now that Christ was with me on it. He restores my soul. Part of that restoration is a shedding of regrets. I used to be riddled with regret and with striving. I am forgiven. Now I feel at peace. I shall not want. I shall dwell with God. So she was able to let go of regrets and striving and to just be in that present place with God. And this is a person who had no children, no spouse, no living parents, no siblings. She was surrounded by a community of friends. And she had a really good death. Well, she was in her 50s.
Mm.
So she was definitely leaving before she'd hoped to leave.
In your spiritual direction, so this idea of regret and striving, do you think, if I were to ask you this question as a spiritual director, do you think striving and regret is something that we as people, and especially people who are not dealing with a foreseeable death because we all have an expiry date, is that something you would say is kind of a problem that most people kind of have to deal with, is regret and striving?
I think you probably have as good ideas on this as I do, but I think regret is helpful as a prompt to repentance, maybe a prompt to making reparations. But I think the Christian faith tells us it's not something to stay in. We're supposed to confess, be forgiven, move forward. So I think the surfacing of regret can be a prompt to that kind of cleansing motion. And striving, uh, there's good in holding on to hope and moving towards it, but it becomes problematic when we're caught in, like Weber's idea of that iron cage of productivity and um, seeing our value based on that.
I'm going to be interviewing the chaplain. He's been a hospital chaplain for a number of years. Excuse me. And one of his concerns about euthanasia is that one of the things that end of life, seemingly the stages that happen at the end of life, so it includes these ideas like regret and how regret leads to some form of purification, and it can lead to getting together with family, doing the writing, reaching out, the things, all of a sudden those things that actually were important all our lives, suddenly you have this idea, okay, I need to do this now. And also he's got this unique idea in terms of it gets rid of ego. So when you're dying, you realize that, well, I'm not going to write the next book. I'm not going to make that next million. I can't do those things. And so that part of the ego kind of dies, and it leaves you this raw self that deals with that it hopefully deals with reality in a real way. But that idea of regret as being a purification, one might almost say that maybe we should welcome some form of, like, the healthy form of regret in our daily lives, and then that would be a form of preparing for death, or at least preparing for better living.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Maybe that's part of that Benedictine practice of memento mori, remembering our death every day, that it does prompt us to try to be as good and as clear with God as we can be, to maintain health in our relationships, to be loving. Yeah.
Are there within the toolbox, you sounds utilitarian, which is bad, but within the toolbox of spiritual direction, are there specific things that you um, suggest to people to think about? Not necessarily during just for dying, but preparing for death, is which we're supposed to be doing for all of our lives.
Well, with the directees who asked me to accompany them in that specifically, uh, part of what we do look at is there anything to pay attention to that's like a block between you and God, that keeps you from being fully open with God? And is there anything in relationships with people you feel a need to address now? And sometimes it's with people who've already passed away. But some people imagine they might encounter them in the afterlife.
Okay.
So they work on that. They work on forgiving those people and trying to see how God might see those people and what the redeemed version of those people might be. People kind of direct their attention to uh, what is most important to them in the process. So I don't really come in with a list of things to address. I listen for what's really active in the person's mind and soul as they're approaching death. Sometimes I'm thinking about one particular person. There can be almost a reflexive return to an old guilt with concern that that will maybe be a deal breaker in terms of getting to go to heaven. And so, as with so many things in spiritual direction, I usually say, how would it be if we took a moment now and you brought that question to God? And I can tell you so far in my experience, 100% of the time, they come out of that time of prayer no longer being concerned about it.
Okay.
And a person I'm thinking about has done this about the same issue multiple times. And so now when exiting prayer just kind of looks at me and says, oh yeah, I forgot. God is love.
So it sounds like in those times that like there is an imputed grace that comes into those moments that people wouldn't have necessarily had before that they do after.
Yeah. Sometimes it can really help to have someone hold you in prayer.
Can you talk more about that, like the holding part?
Just inviting that person to bring whatever this question is. Let's say this question about an old guilt, and just be there with the person while they do that. Takes a certain amount of courage, I think, to bring it before God in prayer. And I think my presence maybe, and maybe the lighted candle, uh, help the person stay focused on God in it rather than just the internal dialogue about it. That's what seems to happen. I have some directees who regularly use the time we're together to go into that kind of prayer. And they tell me that it's just hard to do it on their own. And churches will hold space for that sometimes, but usually not a very long space.
I'm assuming part of that, the difficulty with our culture in being in some form of directed silence is it's not easy.
Well, in group spiritual direction, what we do is a person will share uninterrupted, will speak about something, that seems of spiritual resonance. that they want to bring to the group, speak for maybe 5-10 minutes. And then we move into silent prayer. And then coming out of that prayer, the first thing I always say is, did anything come to you in the silence that you would like to share? And it's a really potent moment. Oh, quite a few times, something new has come in the silent prayer after the sharing. And often it's hearing what God has to say. And so that happens before the other people in the room reflect back something to the person who's shared. But that's another example, in that case, of the group holding that space for prayer.
You've written and spoken about for a number of years now the importance of community, and it's easy to have a word come to a person's mind: community, friendship, let's say, grace, and then you kind of quickly abstract it and I know what that is, without actually really thinking really carefully about those are actually really big words that impact a lot of different areas of life. In terms of community and end of life, I'm assuming you would say it's probably very important, and that those people who have community obviously do better than people without it. Are there ways towards the end that a person can help develop a sense of community better, or at that point it's never too late? But what is your views on the importance of community during end of life?
Well, I'm struck by how some of the people I've worked with are very attuned to their community as they're dying, not just in terms of what the community can do for them, which of course is significant, but in terms of what they can do for the community. And I'll go back to Ruth again, just because it's published and so I can freely read from it. So remember, she has no family. And I visited her in the hospital after a major surgery where it had become clear that the cancer had spread to vital organs. She was holding her Bible and asked me about 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 7 through 12. She was not a church Christian very much. Matter of fact, it was her original diagnosis that brought her to a really deep faith. So, she's going through all of this and she's reading scripture. And she wanted to know what it meant that the life of Jesus may also be made visible in our bodies, in our mortal flesh. And I said to her, I wondered what drew her to that particular passage. And she said, that's what I want. I want this suffering and dying of my body to bear witness to what faith allows. Mm-hmm. And so that became a mission for her, to bear witness to what faith allows. And she did that within her community. She hosted an evening that she called Awake for the Living, because she was still alive. Mm-hmm. And she spoke about her faith to a lot of people who were very, very skeptical, atheist people. I think they were probably more moved by what they saw than by what she said about the mechanics of faith. But, and I think this other woman who died recently, that became part of her experience. She just wanted to welcome whoever showed up. And when we're dying, we don't know who's going to show up. Sometimes the people closest to us have the hardest time showing up. And that can be very disappointing. But then there are these people who haven't been that close, but are part of our community, who draw near. And the person who's dying is essentially ministering to them, even as they care for that person.
Mhm.
It is part of living. It's not living or dying. Dying is part of living.
Mhm.
And to bear witness to what faith allows is a wonderful mission statement for life and for dying. So I'd say, community is very important. But it isn't just that the community is supporting the person who's dying, it's also that there's something beautiful to receive from intimacy with a person who is dying.
Mhm. Mhm. And this is something that I've been hearing in terms of people who want to, and irrespective of, so this, I mean, this issue is including things on euthanasia and MAID, but kind of irrespective of that, whether a person at the very end of their life says, no, I want to end it right now, or wait out to the final last moment. We're talking about people, they're getting towards the final last moment. The thoughts from different chaplains and pastors and clergy and kind of now you is the gift that a dying person can give to those people around them is absolutely, well, it's invaluable because of what the person gets to learn from the person at that final stage. And and partly that's why some of the people talking, against MAID say this is the problem with pulling the plug early, is that it's not just about you, the person who's dying, it's about what you are going to offer to the people who are with you. Hopefully there are people with you that they will see and that they will get to learn. And the whole thing actually is hugely redemptive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. And I would imagine some people choosing MAID are doing it because they don't want to be a burden to those people they're leaving behind. So they're also doing it out of compassion. Yeah. But yes. And I read some about MAID because we were going to have this conversation. And I see that intolerable suffering is also a grounds for assisted dying. And that's a hard one. Just the word intolerable, because these people I'm quoting to you right now were not suffering intolerably. Their pain could be managed. They had pain. They had loss of capacity, but their pain was managed. But I can't imagine anyone wanting to wish intolerable suffering on another.
Mhm.
Nor even to be able to necessarily assess for another what is intolerable. But I imagine the ethicists at hospitals in Canada have to make some of these calls, and those would be hard ones.
Mhm. And you get different people. I mean, so my grandfather, medical doctor, he had absolutely no problem. People who are towards the end of life, you have as much medication as you can possibly handle and more. And if that means it's going to greatly facilitate the closening of death, that is no problem. I think that's the more kind way to go. And that's where sometimes, and again, on any debate, you have people who are, the fundamentalists on each extreme. And I feel very uncomfortable when someone is talking about someone who is in incredible pain and then to say, no, you can't have it because of this particular scripture or because of this particular standard. No, that's problematic. At the same time, then when you have people who are, and then this has been happening increasingly, the much younger, someone who's in their 20s and their 30s, and they are claiming that they're intolerable suffering, and they want to end it all. Well, that's complicated as well. It's a complicated subject, but I don't think a person it's cut and dry is not usually applicable to a lot of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Hard decisions, and I'm sure even afterwards, not complete clarity about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it is true what you're saying about your grandfather. Before all this possibility of medically assisted dying, uh, physicians often would increase morphine when someone, just to cover the pain, even knowing that it would lead to a quicker death.
Mm-hmm.
They just made those decisions compassionately.
Something I heard, now this is from a doctor in Canada who's worked in palliative care for a long time, but again, being specializing in palliative care, she said something that she really notices working in that field is, from what she sees, people who are more interested in MAID tend to be more affluent and very, very independent. And so part of the argument is, they don't want to be a bother to someone, but also they're used to their whole life having total control, or at least most of it. And, towards the end, I'm not really interested. And she said sometimes when the people come, sometimes including those people, they kind of change their mind. They come to palliative care, and suddenly they're surrounded by community who, part of their vocation, I believe, is helping people. They're loving, they're kind. And she said she's had people say, these are some of the best moments of my life. Like, I finally feel like I'm actually alive now. I'm like, now this is like, really, this is what life is. And I thought, oh, that is so heartbreaking to think that a person can live their whole life and then get to the end and miss out on what was really important. And I mean, thank God that they got to experience some, but this is where it would be good if people would be more interested in, again, the kind of the role of community. And of course, I believe that church is very influential to people still. So the pastors need to be talking more about this.
Yeah, there is so much loneliness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And it's hard for people to see that receiving is a good thing to do.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Receiving even from God can be difficult. We're so much about what we can do, what we can offer, what we can produce.
And I would think that would be something that Western culture would greatly contribute to those assumptions. And it would be difficult for most of us because that's what we live in. That's a water that we swim in. And we don't really see how much that is affecting us. But it really does. And especially towards the end of life when those things matter. They don't matter most then, but they matter a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we can conceptualize dying as a failure. That, we have all these tech billionaires investing money in life extension for themselves, cryonics and other sorts of things. And so people can feel like they've somehow failed. And it's not only a secular issue, it can be a religious one too. When I was in my 30s, a friend of mine my age was dying of cancer. And after a while, she really couldn't speak about it in her prayer group. These loving, wonderful people who would come alongside her to meet with her weekly and pray with her, because their understanding was she would be healed if she believed she would be healed. So she couldn't, and I, in my practice, I see people in that kind of bind. That it really does just put the agency all on the sick person. And as though death is abnormal and maybe a failure. So I think that is kind of a modern understanding. I think in modern, maybe global north kind of understanding. I think in societies where there's less ability to forestall death, there's more acceptance of it as a part of the human condition.
And not to disconnect that much, but it might be. My dad loves going to Africa, and he's been in a few African cultures, funerals, and he said he has never seen so much at the funeral. I mean, there is grown men are just travailing and weeping and for days, outside, the particular hut, and he didn't know how to take it at first, and then he kind of said, maybe that's a good thing. Like it releases something that you feel. And I know personally, I've had one particular loss, someone close, and I generally don't have a problem with being emotional. I don't think.
Mm.
And I kind of put it on pause. And that like indwelling spring that comes out of like that morning, it actually seemed to be stopped out for about a year until I was able to sit down and sometime had another experience. And then, there was this outflowing. But I thought to myself, for people, it's something else to properly practice mourning, properly
Yeah.
practice, any type of emotional outflowing. That's, within sense, but that's something too in our culture because we're scared of what's going to happen. And we don't want to show too much emotionality because that is vulnerability. And for the
Mhm.
person who is in that process themselves, not to want other people to express vulnerability because it's a vulnerable thing. That really wasn't a here nor there, but
Yeah, no, I think entering fully into mourning and lament is a kind of cleansing. It and I've had quite a few really close friends die in the last few years, and the mourning and the love go hand in hand. They really do. And I think the mourning becomes less acute over time, but there's still mourning, missing the person who's been. And Ruth, I think maybe one of the last things she said to me before she slipped into unconsciousness was, I trust Christ. Um, I'm grateful and I grieve. The whole truth. She didn't want to be leaving the party early.
right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But to hold spaces where the whole truth can be held, the celebration of the life and the profound loss of that person's presence with us, and to show emotion.
Mm.
Yeah. Some Christian services can be a little too triumphalistic.
Absolutely.
So people who want to cry don't really find the space for it.
Mm-hmm.
Or they feel others think there's something wrong if they're showing emotion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, part of this is the Jesus weeping part is so powerful in terms of God, if anybody knows, everything is going to work out okay, but I'm living here in this moment right now and I am deeply suffering and it's okay. Yeah, sure, the person's in heaven. Who cares? I'm grieving right now. This is terrible.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I was once with a small group of monks looking at that passage, Lazarus, and a couple of the monks thought the reason Jesus was weeping was because Mary and Martha and the others didn't realize that Jesus could bring him back to life. And I thought, no, I don't think that's right. I agree with what you just said. Yeah. Grieving over Lazarus having died and the tremendous grief of those left behind, even though he had the capacity to revive Lazarus. There's still grief.
In terms of, so if you were talking to a thoughtful average person, hopefully me being thoughtful, definitely average, to think about how to be with a person who is at the end of their life, what would some of your suggestions be to me to think about, to reflect on, to deeply ponder before necessarily entering into the presence of that person?
Well, before entering into the presence of that person, remember that God is with you, even as you go. Remember that you're not alone. And I would say with the person to listen, to hear where the person is, because, like with Ruth at the end, at one point she was sort of laughing and I was weeping. And she patted my hand and she says, "It's all right, sweetie." And that ability to hold the whole of it, that that person might not be in exactly the same spot you're in. That person might be feeling just overflowing amount of peace and joy as they're dying. So to pay attention to where they are. And when I teach spiritual directors, I say that there's a sort of emotional teeter-totter. So people might be feeling joy and grief. And if in listening to them, you just respond to one or the other, then you've got the teeter-totter off balance. And that the person who's speaking has to come down harder on the part that they felt wasn't heard. So Ruth is saying, "I feel at peace and I grieve." So if I just respond, "You feel at peace. How wonderful," she would have to say, "And I grieve." Or if I were to say, "I feel the grief with you. I too grieve," she would have to say, "And I feel peace." So holding the whole is important.
Interesting. And similarly, what would your suggestion be for someone who is in the process of dying when they are talking to their family? Hopefully they have family, or their friends, and self-talk as well, I guess.
Gosh. As they're dying, I think expressing love is the best. The night before my mother died, a certain person was going to come and visit her, a person my mother had a lot of critical thoughts about. And I said to my mother, "You need to be nice. Whatever you say tonight will be remembered forever." And bless her heart, she was really nice. Took a lot of interest in the person, expressed a lot of appreciation for the person. And then after the person left, my mother said, "How did I do?" It's really about 12 hours before she died.
Wow.
So I think that's something to remember. Whatever you do as you're dying with people very close to you, granted, you want to be caring for yourself. You want to be resting as closely with God as you can. You don't want to be exposed to everybody else's problems. But this is an important time in your life that people will remember. They will remember what you have to say to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a huge amount of leverage in that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Before I ask the pastor question, is there anything else that you wanted to bring up that I missed or that you wanted to say or?
Well, I just want to say that it has been a tremendous privilege to accompany people to the ends of their lives, and I miss them all terribly. So grateful to have known them. And I don't know how I will approach my own death, other
Okay.
than the way I'm sort of gradually approaching it now. Um, I can't predict. I don't know. I think it depends on all sorts of things, pain being one of those things. Um, but I think conversations like this are very helpful. It's been helpful for me just to think about it and prepare for it. And in the weeks since you've asked, I've had friends get terminal diagnoses and been to a couple memorial services. So it's been very helpful for me to go back and remember what I've learned from people as they've died.
Little side. I think this might have been one of the questions or not, and it doesn't get talked about as much. It does, I think, within Christianity, but would you have anything about the importance to say to ritual?
Yes, I think rituals can be very important. So there can be rituals of surrendering things. Um, this wake for the dying that Ruth had, where really she was just thanking each person, telling them what they meant to her. That can be so important. And we've done that with people. We've, you know, had little gatherings like that with people as they're dying, where everybody gets to say something to the person gets to say something as well. And also can be a helpful thing to do when someone's in an Alzheimer's journey before they're completely unable to do that sort of thing, to gather around and just say, you know, what you've loved about that person, some of the funny memories of times you've shared, just to really bless that person.
I had one particular uncle I have a couple that I'm a great uncle, fairly close to, and he passed very suddenly during COVID. And I remember afterwards he passed, and there was things that I wanted to say, and I never had. I'd met him at Christmas time, and we give the big hug, and I could still feel, the nice warm presence, and then it was gone, and I was gonna even see him when I was in Alberta, and I didn't because I was busy, and then after he passed, I wrote a couple obituaries to friends
Mm.
who were still alive. And I sat down and I thought, okay, like I'm going to have a little bit of wine. I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write like a 2 page, like really, really, really get into this. And of course, during that time, like, I mean, you cry and you laugh because you're remembering. And then I sent it to the person and they were really, really moved. And I think sometimes, for me at least, I have a few more people to think about because when a person's, and it's connected to me, especially because of the Alzheimer's, if a person's forgetting, but while they're still alive, it's nice to be able to give them the gift of this is what you meant to me, this is what you did for me, this is how I wouldn't have been this. This is if my life
Yeah.
is a garden, and hopefully it's nice, partly you contributed these particular flowers to this garden. Thank you so much for contributing to my existence as a person and my flourishing.
What a great thing to do.
I
And
think so.
knowing you a bit, Matthew, I know that you often do that, even in just brief emails. You say, I appreciate this about you, or you say that about my husband. You do that. And that's a wonderful practice. We shouldn't die with all sorts of kind words for other people stored up within ourselves unexpressed. We should just keep sharing those things.
Last question, if you wish. because pastors do have a large amount of influence on people, not as much as they used to, but still they still do. If you were able to speak to a large number of pastors, influential pastors, what would you want to tell them?
About accompanying people as they die.
Exactly, yes.
Uh-huh. I would invite them to care for themselves
Mm,
because, you know, the church is getting older. So even the young pastors I know are dealing with one parishioner after the next, getting a terrible diagnosis and or dying. So it can be inundating. So I would strongly encourage them to have someone with whom they can express all of that that's confidential. So a therapist, a spiritual director, a pastoral counselor, a personal chaplain, whatever, a small group of clergy colleagues where they can really get in touch with the feelings uh, because, you know, it can be overwhelming. That's what I would encourage. And also that they think of themselves as part of the community around the person who's dying. And as much as possible, um, help that community be available to the person who's dying.
mhm,
People might need some coaching as to how to be present with someone who's dying.
mhm,
And a pastor might be able to provide some of that to a group.
mhm.
I've seen pastors do that instead of just bearing the whole weight, him or herself.
As always, thank you very, very much.
Always a joy to be with you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. This, and I really, I appreciate getting your, like you as an individual for what you bring to the world and the words and spirit, but also the, you know, the spiritual direction and also the other things, obviously being, you know, well thought out. Um, because I one of the things that bugs me when I listen to some of this made stuff, it's so much touching on some of these final aspects. And those are really, really important. And yes, you know, there can be, again, to use that word, leverage, like things towards the end can be greatly leveraged, and they do matter morally and ethically and theologically, yes. But also sometimes it's easy to miss out on the, I think it's fair to say, the larger picture on life. Like what does it mean to be alive during those times? And you've helped me think more about that, and I think that's good for people to see as well when they're thinking about something like MAID and living and dying. It's a really, really large topic, and it's good to think about more than just certain issues. So I really appreciate that, being able to have you on here talking about like the things that you've been talking about.
Well, I'm so glad you and Radix are addressing such important things.